The Colorado Rockies do not negotiate with human ego. At 11,000 feet above sea level, the atmosphere is a thin, pressurized veil of oxygen that demands a steep toll from every lung that dares to inhale its crystalline chill. To these ancient peaks, a human being is not a success story, a venture capitalist, or a titan of industry. A human being is merely a heat signature, a temporary, biological flicker against an eternal canvas of indifferent granite and predatory ice. Julian Thorne, 36, was a man who had spent his entire adult life convinced that he could outrun, outcalculate, and outmaneuver the very laws of nature. He was a founder of Thorne Vance Global, a venture capital empire built on a philosophy he called a sovereign rule of efficiency. In Julian's world, anything that didn't move fast enough or produce enough was discarded as friction. He viewed his own body as a high-performance machine, a carbon fiber vessel for an iron will that brooked no dissent. On this particular Tuesday morning, the air at the Silverthorne Pass trailhead was sharp enough to draw blood. It tasted of frozen pine needles and the electric ozone of an approaching atmospheric shift. The weather stations in Denver have been broadcasting red flag warnings for 48 hours, predicting a blackout blizzard, a rare, cyclonic monster capable of dropping 5 feet of snow in a single afternoon. But Julian didn't listen to local meteorologists. He listened to his own heart rate and the digital certainty of his Garmin Fenix 8, a multi-$1,000 piece of sapphire glass and titanium that tracked his blood oxygen, his vertical gain, and his exact GPS coordinates with military-grade precision. To Julian, the data was a reality. If the watch said he had a 2-hour window for a 20-mile ridge run, the mountains would simply have to comply. Optimal conditions for a threshold effort. Julian whispered to the biting wind. His voice sounded thin and fragile in the vast, echoing silence of the mountains. He adjusted the straps of his $800 ultra-running pack, a minimalist masterpiece that contained nothing but high-calorie gels and a pressurized hydration bladder. He carried no thermal blanket, no emergency radio, and no signaling flares. In his world, weight was the primary enemy of speed, and speed was the sovereign of survival. As he prepared to trigger the start on his watch, a sound broke the silence. A soft, rhythmic thump-thump against the frozen dirt. Julian turned to see a dog sitting near the trailhead marker. It was a massive, shaggy creature, a chaotic tapestry of German Shepherd Husky, and something older, something lupin. Its fur was a matted mess of gray dust, dried mud, and ancient burrs. Its eyes were the most unsettling part. One was a piercing, crystalline blue, while the other was a warm, muddy brown. They held a gaze that was unervingly intelligent, a steady look of profound, silent judgment. The dog wasn't wagging its tail. It wasn't begging. It was simply observing. "Go on, get out of here," Julian snapped, waving a hand toward the beast. "I don't have time for strays." "Move along, mutt." The dog let out a low, huffing sound, a vibration Julian felt in the soles of his carbon-plated shoes more than he heard it. It stood up, its heavy paws crunching the frost, and took a single step toward the ascent. It looked back at Julian, its blue eye reflecting the cold light of the morning. It was an invitation, or perhaps a final warning. "I said, beat it!" Julian growled, lunging forward to scare the animal. The dog didn't flinch. It simply turned and trotted into the shadows of the pine trees, vanishing with a silence that seemed impossible for its size. Julian shook his head, his mind already returning to the efficiency of the run. He hit the start button. The watch emitted a sharp, digital beep, the last artificial sound he would hear for a very long time. He began his ascent, his legs moving with the rhythmic, mechanical precision of a piston. He was a sovereign of the trail, a man of light and data, heading directly into a world that was about to turn into a white, screaming hell. The first 3 miles were a masterclass in human performance. Julian's heart rate stabilized at a perfect 142 beats per minute. His pace was steady, his breathing perfectly synchronized to the strike of his feet against the rising terrain. He climbed to the Golden Belt, the zone where the aspens gave way to the ancient, twisted bristlecone pines. The world was a cathedral of stone and sky. But as he crested 12,500 feet, the universe began to change. It wasn't a gradual darkening. It was as if a giant, celestial hand had suddenly pulled a gray, suffocating curtain across the sun. The wind, would have been a gentle whisper, transformed into a physical weight, a high-pitched, pressurized shriek that tore the heat from Julian's body in seconds. The first snowflakes weren't soft. They were sharp, frozen needles that struck his exposed skin with the force of shrapnel. Just a localized squall, Julian told himself, his internal monologue fighting the rising tide of adrenaline. Maintain the pace. Protect the output. He looked at his watch. The screen was flickering. The sapphire glass was already covered in a layer of instant frost. The GPS signal, which had been his North Star, began to jump erratically across the map. The lithium-ion battery, designed for the optimal conditions of a lab, was dying in the face of the 30-degree below zero wind chill. "No," Julian hissed, shaking his wrist. "Work, damn you." The watch died. The digital world, the multi-billion-dollar infrastructure of satellites and sensors that Julian had trusted with his life, was gone. He was left with nothing but his own senses, and they were failing him. The whiteout hit with the force of an explosion. In seconds, visibility dropped from miles to inches. The trail, the rocks, and the trees vanished into a flat, featureless void of screaming white. Julian spun around, tried to find his bearings, but his vestibular system, the internal gyroscope of the human ear, collapsed under the pressure of the wind. Up was down. Left was right. He took a step, expecting solid ground, and felt the sickening lurch of a snow-covered void. He tumbled down a steep embankment, his body a chaotic tangle of limbs and high-tech gear. He hit the bottom of a hidden ravine with a thud that knocked the very air from his lungs. He lay there, gasping, the cold air searing his throat like liquid fire. He was lost. He was alone. And for the first time in his life, Julian Thorne realized that his sovereign rule had no power over gravity of a mountain. If you're enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell. The cold was no longer a temperature. It was a predator. It moved through Julian's high-performance clothing as if the fabric were made of spiderwebs. He could feel the blood retreating from his extremities, his body making the brutal, sovereign decision to sacrifice his fingers and toes to protect his heart. His mind began to wander, the first signs of the cognitive slide. He thought about his office in Denver. He thought about the millions of dollars that were currently sitting in his bank account, money that couldn't buy him a single degree of warmth. Just a small nap, he whispered, his eyes heavy with the weight of the frost. 5 minutes. Then I'll find the way. This was a white sleep, the final, merciful lie that the brain tells before the heart stops. Julian began to close his eyes, the roar of the wind fading into a soft, melodic hum. Then a weight hit him. It was a heavy, wet impact that sent a jolt of raw adrenaline through his fading nervous system. Julian groaned, his eyes snapping open. A massive, shaggy face was inches from his own. It was the stray dog. Its fur was clumped with ice, its blue and brown eyes staring at him with an intensity that was almost frightening. It wasn't barking. It was growling, a deep, rhythmic vibration that Julian felt in the very center of his chest. The dog grabbed Julian by the shoulder of his jacket, its teeth tearing through the expensive fabric. It pulled him, dragging his dead weight across the snow. Get off me!" Julian rasped, his hands too numb to even form a fist. The dog ignored him. It was a sovereign of the wild, and it had identified a system in failure. It dragged Julian toward a cluster of boulders that had been hollowed out by centuries of wind, a lee-side shelter where the pressure of the blizzard was slightly less lethal. The dog pushed Julian into the narrow gap between the stones, then did something that defied every rule of Julian's world. It didn't run for its own safety. It lay down directly on top of him. The warmth was immediate. It was a heavy, living heat that smelled of wet earth, old pine, and the primal energy of survival. Julian felt the dog's heart beating against his own, a slow, steady, powerful thump-thump that was far more reliable than the digital clock on his dead watch. "Why?" Julian whispered, his face buried in the dog's matted fur. "Why are you doing this?" The dog let out a long, low sigh, its breath a cloud of white vapor in the dark of the rocks. It didn't need a reason. It didn't need a performance metric. It was a stray variable that had become the only thing keeping the billionaire's heart beating in the center of the white hell. As the night deepened, The blizzard transformed into a pressurized wall of noise. Julian felt the dog's muscles tensing every time a particularly violent gust of wind threatened to breach their small sanctuary. The animal was acting as a thermal shield, its thick double coat absorbing the frost that would have otherwise settled on Julian's chest. In the darkness, Julian's mind, once so focused on the acquisition of wealth, began to unravel. He saw the faces of the people he had optimized out of their jobs over the years. He saw the small, family-owned firms he had dismantled for their patents. He realized that he had built a life of total insulation, surrounded by people who were paid to agree with him and machines that were programmed to serve him. None of them were here. Only the mutt remained. He felt a profound sense of shame. He remembered the way he had lunged at the dog at the trailhead, trying to scare it away because it didn't fit into his efficient schedule. He realized that the dog had seen the storm coming long before the satellites had. The animal had tried to guide him, but he had been too blinded by his own data to see the truth. "I'm sorry," Julian whispered into the dog's ear. He reached out with his stiff, gray fingers and buried them in the dog's fur, clinging to the animal as it were the only solid thing in a dissolving universe. "I'm so sorry." The dog shifted its weight, its tail thumping once against a stone. It wasn't a gesture of forgiveness. It was a gesture of presence. In the sovereign rule of the wild, there is no room for apologies, only for the shared labor of staying alive. They lay there for hours, two heartbeats synchronized against the infinite cold, waiting for a morning that Julian no longer believed he deserved to see. If you are enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell. The hours between midnight and dawn in a high-altitude blizzard do not pass in linear time. They exist in a distorted, pressurized vacuum where every second is a battle against the encroaching stillness of death. Inside the small crevice between the granite boulders, the world was reduced to a singular, desperate frequency. The heavy, rhythmic thumping of the stray dog's heart and the ragged, shallow gasp of a man whose life had been stripped of its digital armor. Julian Thorne lay pinned beneath the immense weight of the animal, his body shivering so violently that it felt as if his very bones were trying to rattle themselves loose from his skin. The heat of the dog was a miracle, a dense organic furnace that smelled of wet fur, ancient dust, and survival. It was a heat that Julian's billion-dollar portfolio could never have purchased. As the wind screamed outside their stone sanctuary, a sound like 1,000 freight trains colliding in the dark, Julian's mind began to drift into the gray zones of hypothermia. He wasn't just cold. He was experiencing the dissolution of his own identity. The sovereign rule of efficiency was being overwritten by the primal rule of existence. He began to hallucinate. He saw his office on the 60th floor of the Thorne Vance Tower in Denver, a room of glass, light, and absolute control. He saw himself sitting at his desk, firing a regional manager because his output metrics had dropped by 4%. He remembered the look in the man's eyes, not anger, but a hollow, exhausted defeat. Julian had called it optimizing the system. Now, lying in the freezing mud and snow, Julian realized that he had spent his life optimizing for a world that didn't exist. He had built a fortress of numbers to hide from the reality of the wind and the ice. He thought of the dog, the variable he had tried to shoo away at the trailhead. He had viewed the animal as a broken piece of the world, something that didn't contribute to his threshold effort. And yet this broken thing was the only reason his heart was still beating. The dog shifted its weight, a low, protective growl vibrating in its throat as a particularly violent gust of wind sent a spray of ice crystals into their hollow. The animal adjusted its body, tucking its nose deeper into Julian's neck, its shaggy for a shield against the void. "I'm a ghost," Julian whispered, the words freezing before they could leave his lips. "I've been a ghost for years." He realized that his arrogance hadn't just been about the mountain. It had been about the soul. He had believed that his wealth made him sovereign over the world. But the mountain had shown him that sovereignty is a lie we tell ourselves to feel safe in the dark. The only true sovereignty was a heat shared between two living things in the middle of a storm. He reached out with his stiff, gray fingers and buried them in the dog's thick coat, clinging to the animal as if it were the last solid thing in a dissolving universe. He promised himself that if he lived, if he ever saw the sun again, he would stop trying to outrun the world and start trying to live in it. If you are enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell. Morning arrived not with a burst of light, but with a slow, agonizing transition from black to a flat, featureless gray. The blizzard had subsided into a steady, rhythmic snowfall, but the temperature remained in a lethal, bone-crushing range. Julian woke to the sound of the dog licking his face, a rough, sandpaper tongue that felt like fire against his frostbitten skin. He tried to move, but his body felt like a heavy, rusted machine. His legs were numb, his joints screaming with the stiffness of a night spent in a pressurized stone box. The dog stood up, shaking the thick layer of frost from its shaggy coat. It stood at the edge of the rocks, its nose twitching, its blue and brown eyes scanning the white out for a path that Julian couldn't see. The animal didn't look tired. It looked focused. It let out a single, sharp bark, a command that echoed through the silent, snow-choked ravine. I can't stand, boy." Julian gasped, his voice a dry, jagged rasp. The dog didn't accept his defeat. It walked back into the hollow, grabbed the sleeve of Julian's jacket, and pulled with a strength that was terrifying. It was forcing him back into the world of action. It knew that the life pocket between the stones was now a tomb. If they didn't move, the cold would eventually reach the center of their hearts. Julian used the rough surface of the granite to pull himself upright, his vision swimming in a sea of gray and white. The world was a flat, horizontal void where the trail had been erased by 4 feet of fresh, wind-driven powder. He took his first step, and the pain was an explosion of white light in his brain. His feet felt like blocks of wood, disconnected from his nerves. But the dog was there, leaning its heavy body against his leg, providing a biological crutch. They began to move, not toward the trail Julian thought he remembered, but toward the dense cluster of ancient bristlecone pines on the northern ridge. The dog was following a different map, a map of scent, wind pressure, and the deep, sovereign intuition of the wild. Every 10 yards, Julian would stumble, his face hitting the ice. Each time, the urge to simply stay down, to let the white blanket cover him forever, was almost overwhelming, but the dog would not allow it. It would circle him, barking, nudging, growling until Julian found the strength to claw his way back to his feet. They moved with an agonizing slowness, a man of data being led by a dog of instinct through a world that had forgotten them both. "Why are you doing this?" Julian asked, his mind fracturing under the pressure of the cold. "I have nothing for you. No scraps, no home. Why do you stay?" The dog didn't look back. It simply kept its eyes on the horizon, its tail thumping once against a buried log. It wasn't staying for a reward. It was staying because the bond of survival is the only law that matters when the sun is gone. They reached the edge of a frozen stream, a path of least resistance that led toward the valley floor. But the ice was thin, a translucent skin over a dark, rushing torrent of lethally cold water. The dog stopped, its ears flattened against its head, listening to the vibration of the water beneath the frost. It was a moment of absolute, sovereign tension. One wrong step, and the mountain would finally win. If you're enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell. The descent toward the valley floor was a journey through a landscape of jagged white despair. Julian Thorne no longer felt like a man. He felt like a collection of failing systems, a biological machine whose fuel lines were frozen and whose processor was flickering in the dark. Every step was a calculated risk, a gamble against the gravity of the rocks and the shifting, unstable architecture of the snowdrifts. Beside him, the stray dog moved with fluidity that was almost insulting to Julian's shattered coordination. The animal seemed to read the topography of the mountain not with its eyes, but with its very bones, sensing the hollows beneath the snow and the hidden traps of the rain. Before they could snap shut, they reached the Devil's Churn, a narrow, high-velocity creek that cut to the center of the ravine. In the summer, it was a tourist paradise of crystal-clear water and mossy stones. Now, it was a pressurized vein of liquid ice, covered by a translucent, fractal skin of frozen mist. To Julian, the creek represented a path of least resistance, a natural highway that led directly to the lower elevations. But to the dog, the creek was a living, breathing predator. The dog stopped at the edge of the ice, its ears flattened against its shaggy skull, its body tensing into a low, defensive crouch. It emitted a soft, rhythmic whine, a sound profound, sovereign warning. Julian, however, was beyond caution. His brain, starved of warmth and oxygen, saw only the smooth, flat surface of the ice. He stepped out, his carbon-plated shoes finding no purchase on the slick, deceptive skin of the water. It's solid, boy," Julian whispered, his voice a ghost of a sound. "It's a shortcut. We have to move." He took another step, putting his full weight onto the center of the creek. Beneath the surface, the devil's churn groaned, a deep, industrial sound of structural failure that resonated to the soles of Julian's feet. The ice didn't just break. It shattered into 1,000 jagged, obsidian shards. The shock was a physical explosion. As Julian's legs plunged into the 32-degree water, his nervous system underwent a total, catastrophic reboot. The cold wasn't a sensation. It was a blade that cut through his muscles, reaching for the marrow. His heart skipped a beat, then another, the sudden cold shock response, threatening to trigger a lethal cardiac arrest. He gasped, his mouth open in a silent scream, as the current grabbed his legs, trying to pull his exhausted body beneath the ice. "No!" he managed to choke out, his hands clawing at the slippery edge of the fracture. But his fingers were useless blocks of wood. He began to slide. The dark, rushing water was a hand reaching up from the abyss, pulling him toward the silence. Suddenly, a force grabbed the collar of his jacket. The dog had lunged forward, its heavy paws digging into the frozen bank with desperate, primal intensity. It wasn't just pulling. It was bracing its entire body against the weight of the man and the current. The dog's growl was no longer a warning. It was a roar of unyielding protection. For 5 agonizing seconds, time became a solid thing, a tug-of-war between the mountain's hunger and the animal's loyalty. With a roar of effort that came from the very center of its wild soul, the dog heaved. Julian felt himself being dragged upward, out of the liquid fire of the creek, and back onto the solid, unforgiving snow. He lay there, his lower body encased in a rapidly freezing sheet of ice, his heart hammering against his ribs in a frantic, irregular rhythm. The dog didn't back away. It immediately threw its wet, shivering body over Julian's legs, its heat a desperate, sovereign countermeasure against the frostbite. Julian looked at the animal, and the last of his arrogance dissolved into a flood of raw, human tears. He realized that he had spent his life trying to be the alpha of every boardroom and every trail. But in the heart of the storm, he was just a child being held by a guardian he had tried to discard. If you are enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories, and activate the notification bell. The transition from the silence of the mountain to the mechanical roar of the rescue was a sensory blur that Julian's mind struggled to categorize. He lay in a state of pre-death euphoria, a condition where the brain, convinced that the end is near, begins to project images of warmth and light. He saw his mother's kitchen in Virginia. He smelled the scent of old books and autumn leaves. He was no longer in the Rockies. He was home, but the dog knew the truth. It could hear the frequency of the rotors long before the human ear could process the sound. The animal stood up, its fur a jagged mess of ice and gray mud, and began to bark. It wasn't the bark of a pet. It was a sovereign beacon, a deep, percussive sound that resonated to the canyon walls like a foghorn. The sound of the helicopter grew from a distant hum into a chest-thumping vibration. Julian opened his eyes, the gray sky now illuminated by a powerful, sweeping searchlight that cut through the falling snow like a sword of light. Heat signature confirmed. Sector 7 Delta. Near the creek. We have a positive ID. The voice from the overhead speakers was a metallic, godlike boom. Julian watched through a haze of frost as the orange-clad figures of the Alpine rescue team descended on ropes, their movement a masterclass in professional, high-stakes coordination. They hit the snow with a soft thud, their headlamps creating a chaotic, shifting landscape of shadows. "Mr. Thorne, can you hear me?" "Julian, stay with us." A technician knelt beside him, his hands moving with a practiced, clinical speed as he wrapped Julian in a pressurized, self-heating thermal blanket. He checked Julian's vitals, his expression one of profound disbelief. "His core temperature is in the lethal range. I don't know how he's still breathing." It's like something was keeping his chest warm for hours. The technician looked up and saw the dog. The animal was standing 5 feet away, its head tilted, its blue and brown eyes reflecting the orange glow of the rescue flares. It looked like a soldier whose tour of duty had just ended. The dog, Julian rasped, his hand reaching out from the folds of the thermal blanket. Don't let him go. He saved me. We've got him, sir. Don't worry. We'll get you both out, the rescuer said, though his eyes remained on the dog. He had seen many things in the Rockies, but he had never seen a stray animal maintain a guard duty in a blackout blizzard for 24 hours. It defied the rule of self-preservation. As they loaded Julian into the rescue basket, a sudden gust of wind sent a swirl of white powder across the meadow. When the air cleared, the dog was gone. It hadn't waited for the helicopter. It hadn't waited for the reward. It had faded back into the white world of the pines, a sovereign spirit that had fulfilled its contract with the universe. Wait! Julian tried to shout, but the rotors drowned out his voice. The dog! Where is he? He's okay, Julian. He's a mountain dog. He knows his way home, the technician said, but Julian saw the look of uncertainty in the man's eyes. As the helicopter lifted off, pulling Julian away from the white hell and back toward the world of glass and light, he looked down at the ravine. He saw the devil's churn, the gnarled bristlecone pines and the jagged rocks. He saw the life pocket where he should have died. And for the first time in his life, the billionaire understood that the most valuable things in the world aren't the ones you can buy, but the ones that are brave enough to stay when the light goes out. If you are enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell. The recovery of Julian Thorne was a process that the medical staff at St. Jude's Regional described as a statistical impossibility. He spent 12 days in the intensive care unit, his body encased in a complex web of heating blankets and fluid replacement drips. The frostbite had claimed 2 of his toes, and his lungs, once capable of sustaining a sub-3-hour marathon, were now scarred by the crystalline fire of the mountain air. To the doctors, he was a miracle of modern physiology. To the press, he was the billionaire who beat the blizzard. But to Julian, lying in the sterile white silence of the hospital room, he was a man who had finally seen his own reflection in the eyes of a stray dog. The sound of the hospital, the rhythmic beep of the EKG, the soft hiss of the oxygen concentrator, the distant squeak of rubber saws on linoleum, felt artificial and hollow. He found himself closing his eyes, trying to recapture the vibration of the dog's heart against his chest. He missed the smell of wet earth and pine. He missed the weight of a life that didn't care about his net worth. The board is calling every hour, Julian, his sister Elena, said softly as she sat by his bed on the 14th day. She was the only person who saw past the CEO mask. They're terrified. The markets are reacting to your instability. They want a public statement. They want to know when the sovereign of Thornvance is coming back to the tower. Julian looked out the window, toward the distant, jagged peaks of the Rockies. They looked peaceful from here, but he knew the truth of their teeth. The sovereign of the tower is dead. Elena, he said, his voice a gravelly, permanent reminder of the cold. He died in a life pocket under a bristlecone pine. I'm not going back to the acquisitions. I'm not going back to the optimization of people. His first act upon being discharged was a total, structural realignment of his empire. He liquidated 60% of his personal holdings, a move that sent shockwaves through the financial world. He didn't build a new tower. He established a sovereign sanctuary, a 50,000-acre wildlife preserve in the heart of the Silverthorne Pass. He turned his high-tech resource network, the same satellites and sensors that had failed him during the storm, into a tool for environmental preservation and protection of stray and wild animals. He realized that the only way to repay his debt to the mountain was to become its guardian. But there was one piece of the geometry missing. For months, Julian returned to the trailhead every single Saturday. He would sit on the same rock where he had first encountered the dog, his new titanium cane resting against his leg. He would stay for hours, watching the shadows of the pines lengthen across the frost. He used his resources to hire the best trackers and the most advanced infrared drones to find the shaggy animal with the blue and brown eyes. But the mountain kept its secret. The stray, variable, remained a ghost, a sovereign spirit that refused to be categorized or captured. If you are enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories, and activate the notification bell. One evening, exactly a year after the blizzard, Julian was sitting at the trailhead. The air was turning cold, the sky a bruised purple that mirrored the night of the storm. He felt a sudden, familiar vibration in the dirt, a rhythmic thump-thump. He turned his head, his breath catching in his scarred lungs. There, standing at the edge of the forest, was the dog. It looked exactly as it had a year ago, matted, rugged, and unyielding. It didn't approach him for a treat. It didn't bark for attention. It simply stood there, its blue and brown eyes reflecting the setting sun. Julian stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't try to grab the animal. He didn't try to put a collar on it. He simply stood in the silence and bowed his head. "Thank you," Julian whispered, the words carrying the weight of a year of transformation. The dog let out a low, huffing sound, the same vibration Julian had heard at the beginning of his journey. It took a single step forward, sniffed the air around Julian's hand, and then turned back toward the deep woods. It wasn't a pet. It was a partner. It was a sovereign of the wild, and it had seemed that its student was finally learning the lesson. Julian watched until the gray fur disappeared into the shadows of the ancient pines. He walked back to his car, his gait slow but steady. He realized that the stray dog hadn't just saved his body from the ice. It had saved his soul from the glass. He had found his own sovereign destiny in the most unlikely place. Not at the peak of a mountain, but in the heart of a variable he had once tried to discard. The Rockies still do not negotiate. But for Julian Thorne, they were no longer a battlefield. They were home. And every time the wind screamed through the Silverthorne Pass, he didn't feel fear. He felt the vibration of a heartbeat that had taught him how to finally be alive. If you are enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell.